So what I'd like to do tonight is share some of what I talk about in my book that came out from the University of California Press just last year in 2019, and to really highlight the main findings, the kinds of research that I did, and also what I think is really important to acknowledge is the really important farm worker organizing that's also happening in the state, and that has been happening essentially since just before I got here in 2011. So a couple of notes: the pictures that I share are shared with permission to talk about an applied work project that I do with UVM Extension, which I will talk a bit about. And especially since the last election, I typically share images of people who have returned home to Mexico, again, just as a sort of a security and kind of a thing to look out for. So the title of the book was something that came to me as I was driving around rural Franklin County with Eric Holt Jimenez, actually, who is the former director of Food First, which is a really great think tank out on the West Coast looking at food justice and food sovereignty issues. And we were talking about the border patrol vehicles that we were passing and the sort of the empty open spaces that we were driving through. And we got into a discussion about how we were on a series of visits to farm worker homes that day. And we started thinking about, the multiple borders that farm workers experience, sometimes the Guatemala-Mexico border, the Mexico-US border, and then the US-Canada border that they're living very close to. This is not meant to sort of downplay the very real violence and crises that are happening at the US-Mexico border, but I think it is important that we also pay attention to all of the borders that surround our nation, and those that are both physical and the ones that are also sort of cultural, linguistic, certainly political, as we are seeing. So this is the cover of the book, and I want to spend just a minute thinking about it. I was really fortunate to have a press and an editor that was very interested in my thoughts on what the cover would look like. And of all the decisions that went into this book, this was one of the ones that kept me up thinking about, what would that first cover of my first book look like? So this image was taken by Caleb Kenna, who is a photographer. Many of you might know his work through the Golden Cage exhibit. This image is part of that exhibit. And when I presented a few different options to the press, they really connected with this one because of all of the stories that are contained in just, this one still frame. Here we have a young mother taking care of her baby as she's working, milking cows, and, the baby is sort of suspended in a car seat in the mosquito netting. And I think that spending some time thinking about, how we ourselves understand farm workers, what images come to mind. This image might be actually really different than those images that we have, but it's an important one to think about. Though, as I'll talk about, the experiences of women in the state are certainly, they're less numerous. Women are in the farm worker community. So I want to start out just by talking a little bit about sort of the broader dairy industry and what we know about immigrant workers in that industry. From the National Milk Producers Federation, which is not the most sort of, left-leaning or labor backing kind of a institution. We know that about half of all workers on U.S. dairy farms are immigrants. Most of those are from Latin America, most specifically from Mexico. And if we were to lose these workers, right, if we were to have a rounding up of these workers, we would see tremendous economic impacts. Our retail milk prices would probably double, and the US economy would be hit by about a $32 billion cut. And I think that, it's important to have these kinds of numbers in mind, even as I don't want to rely only on economic understandings of what farm workers contribute to the United States. But when we look at our food system, whether it's the dairy industry, whether it's meat packing facilities, whether it's the back kitchens of restaurants that we enjoy going to, we know across the food system, it's really propped up on immigrant workers. And I think it's important that we come to terms with that and we think about how in many ways our food and agricultural policies are really out of touch with our immigration policies. Or perhaps that's exactly what is the intent, is to keep these workers sort of underpaid, unseen, and invisible. So this is a fact of Vermont. It's also a fact of states like Wisconsin and New York and California and Colorado, where we do see really large dairies. Um, and I'm happy to talk about some of the changes to labor patterns, things like robotic milking and those kinds of potential changes on the horizon if people are interested in the Q&A. So getting closer to Vermont, what we know based on data from UVM Extension is that there's probably between 1,000 and 1,200 farm workers from Latin America in the state. Roughly 90% of these workers are undocumented. I was giving a similar talk actually on a panel with a farm owner from the Upper Valley, and he kind of leaned over. He's like, "It's closer to 99%." So when we look at the questions of citizenship for these workers in the state, it's important to realize that there is no real legal pathway into finding work in the dairy industry as an immigrant. The program like the H-2A visa program that brings workers, for example, into the apple industry. I'm sure that many of you have seen the press on the COVID outbreak there. That program does not apply to dairy workers because that is a seasonal program, a seasonal visa program, and dairy work is not seasonal work, it's year-round work. And so our elected representatives have actually argued for an expansion of the H-2A visa program to include dairy. I don't think that's the best option because that program is rife with a lot of problems. But it's important to realize that when we're looking at this industry, whether it's in Vermont or Wisconsin or New York or any of these other states, there's a really high percentage of undocumented workers who are milking cows. A lot of the workers in Vermont are coming from central and southern Mexico. There's some workers from Guatemala, but really we're looking at places in Mexico that have really important sort of indigenous histories and places that have been especially really hard hit by things like NAFTA, and the rural livelihoods of central and southern Mexico have certainly changed a great deal in the last 25 years. And most of these workers are men. They are mostly young men, although there are workers as old as, I think the oldest I knew was 63. And there's steady numbers of women, but women, when they are here, are more likely to be coming to join their male partners than working, although there are a number of women working on dairy farms, sometimes not milking, but doing other forms of work. So one of the things that I talk about in this book is this idea of visibility and invisibility, and how when we're looking at a state like Vermont, one that is very rural, very cold, and very white, people of color, whether they are farm workers or whether they are, Vermont-born people of color, are very visible in the landscape. When we look at the ethnic diversity of the state, we are often the least or second least ethnically diverse place, especially when we go into some of the rural areas of Vermont. So what I talk about in this book is this sort of, I would say, paradox of farm workers being sort of invisible in our own imaginings of Vermont. When we think about the Vermont brand, farm workers and their lives don't necessarily rise to the top of our image of Vermont, but their visibility and the fact that they challenge that kind of dominant whiteness of the state often puts them at risk of deportation and detention. And we've seen, that very actively pursued in recent years. And so when we do come to our sort of understandings of Vermont, this image was taken by my research assistant, Jessie Mazar, the sort of the mist, the cows, the rolling green hills. These images don't capture the full reality of our agricultural system here. And what I try to do in this book is to bring a bit more visibility to the experiences of farm workers in the state and their contributions, both economic and cultural, and when we're looking at food justice movements, really significant contributions there. So my book was based on 7, 8, 9 years. It kind of, when did it start? But many, many years of ethnographic research, both doing survey work, doing partisan observation, and doing interviews. I'll talk a little bit about the food security surveys that I did. But one of the terms that farm workers use to describe their lives, really more than any other word, is this term encerrado, which translates to a number of different things: being confined, being trapped, being bounded, being enclosed. Farm workers often feel very bound to the farms where they live and they work, because of a fear of being seen, because of the really intensive hours that they are working, and because of often the full realization of how close they are to the US-Canada border. And as people who often don't have documentation, that puts them at risk, and means that their lives in Vermont are often very closely bound to the places where they're living and working. So this is an understanding that, I have come up with my research. Caleb Kenna and the Golden Cage Project, also talks about this idea. But one of the things that, I've been thinking through a lot recently, and I wrote a brief piece about this, is that as we've all been sort of pushed to our homes with COVID and, feeling sometimes trapped in our homes, this reality is something that farm workers have experienced much longer than just the past 7 months. Um, and certainly there's gulfs of privilege and difference that we can think about too. So that term is explored throughout my book, and people's feelings of being enclosed or being kind of confined to their homes. And one of the things that I really try to figure out is, what is the implication of that? What's the importance of that for accessing food? I'm a food anthropologist. I help run the graduate program in food systems at UVM. And as I was talking about just today with my graduate students, food studies and food scholarship, it just really offers a number of ways about thinking about, anything from spirituality to health to gender, to all of these things. And so for me, looking at food access was a way of thinking about people's relationships with space and place, and with the border. So I wanted to bring up some maps because I think I'm a wannabe geographer in some ways, and I think it's really important to sort of situate this conversation in place and space. And so the map on the left is taken from a project that I contributed to called Food Across Borders. It's a good edited volume looking at lots of different kinds of borders, not just the US-Mexico or US-Canada border, but borders of culture and so on and so forth. So this map shows us how far into the state Border Patrol has jurisdiction, which is 100 miles into the state. That encloses roughly, I think, 90% of the state's residents. And as we see, 2/3, if not more, of the state's landmass itself. The darker zone, the 25-mile zone, is known as the primary operating domain, and that's where Border Patrol is especially active. So the map on the right is produced by my colleagues at UVM Extension's Bridges to Health program. And the overlay, we can see that 100-mile zone going through Rutland and Windsor counties, and the 25-mile zone going through the top of Chittenden. The entirety of Franklin County is enclosed, parts of the Northeast Kingdom. That sort of translates those border zones into our understandings of the counties. And on this map, one individual dot is reflective of one individual farm worker. So we know that farm workers are concentrated in Addison and Franklin counties, a lot also in Orleans County, some up in the islands as well. But if we look at that, the majority of farm workers are experiencing Vermont in that border zone, that 100-mile zone. This kind of map, I often say, would never be possible in New York State. It wouldn't be possible to produce something like this in California. And so kind of coming to terms with the fact that, we do know where farm workers are working. We do know the parts of the state that they are. but we haven't necessarily seen immigration raids. We aren't seeing raids on farms. However, once farm workers are off the farm and in public, they often feel a great deal of fear and anxiety about this border reality. And so throughout the book, I talk about these sort of spatial dynamics, even thinking about how farm workers in Addison County, in some ways are sympathetic, and they feel like their colleagues up in Franklin County have a much harder time, even just that hour closer that they might live to the border. And I'll talk a little bit about that, how that translates into food security, which is my specific interest. So as we know, Vermont's dairy industry has changed a lot. What we've seen with the pandemic and the dumping of milk because of, drying up markets and schools and other industries and other places. Vermont's dairy industry has, really taken a pretty serious hit over the last 70 years. We have seen, like we see in all sectors of the food system and in dairy in other states, a really sort of tightening of consolidation and industrialization, that we have fewer farms now, but those farms are much bigger. We are producing more milk with the few number of farms that still exist than we did with 11,000 dairies that were here in 1940. The most recent numbers I've seen, dip down to something like 667, I believe, dairies are left in the state. And so we have seen just a complete transformation in the industry itself. And while I don't interview and I don't explore sort of farm owner perspectives in this book, I think they are very important to include because this industry has really tightened down and has placed pressure on farm workers and farm owners alike. So we know that about nearly 70% of Vermont's milk comes from dairies that employ migrant workers, about 43% of New England's milk supply. And so they play a very important economic role. Vermont is the most dependent state on one agricultural commodity. And if we were to see even greater sort of risks or endangerments to our dairy economy, we would have a really important problem on our hands to deal with. There's been some research that has been done with farm workers. My colleagues over in CDAE, Community Development Applied Economics at UVM, have done some work on health access and housing. And what we know is that dairy work is one of the more dangerous forms of agricultural work. And farm workers who are often very far from home experience depression and social isolation, anxiety, also the physical pain of a very hard job, but face a number of barriers in accessing care. And so the barriers in accessing food are mirrored in other kinds of access to basic needs, and healthcare is certainly one of those. My colleague who runs Bridges to Health, will say that there's not a whole lot of interpreters here, for example. So even just things like that, are challenges that farm workers face in this state. So I'm really interested in food security and how people understand food, how people access it, how people prioritize it. And when we think about food security, we often think about it in really quantitative ways, right? The number of calories that you can access, or how many different foods you might end up with on your plate. And I think that those quantitative measures are important. But as an anthropologist and as a cultural anthropologist, I'm much more interested and drawn to the stories of food security and how people relate to the food that they eat. So this image was taken in a farm worker home. And these are tomatillos that this farm worker had grown in his garden that he tended to alongside the really numerous hours he worked per week. So what we can see in this is that this is about predictability, right? That this individual is going to have tomatillos for several weeks, if not months. He knows that tomatillos store pretty well if they're kept in their husk. They don't necessarily need a lot of processing and refrigeration. And when I think about food security as an anthropologist, I'm as if not more interested in these kinds of stories, in the ways that people relate to food and the ways that people prioritize, especially culturally familiar foods when they think about their own diets. And so other studies that have looked at farm worker food security, often those in more traditional destinations of migration, have found that farm workers often experience food insecurity at 3 to 4 times the national average, which currently is hovering around 14%. So that means that between, roughly 42% and nearly 70%, if I'm doing the math right, nearly 60% of farm workers are experiencing some kind of inequitable access to food. And that to me is just a really poignant piece, right? And what we know is that there's higher rates of food insecurity among restaurant workers, among school cafeteria workers. And I think it says a lot about our food system that people who create food for us and who cook food for us and who drive food to us often don't experience that access to food themselves. So before I did this work, there was really no data on food security within the farm worker community in Vermont or New England more generally. And so I set out to really try to contribute to our understanding of that. And alongside that, I've been involved as a co-director of a project called Huertas, which is Spanish for kitchen garden, which is a food security initiative connected to UVM Extension's Bridges to Health program. And I want to talk a little bit about that program because it's been absolutely essential in me doing my research, but it's also allowed me to understand, the multiple relationships that farm workers do have with food. So the USDA uses a very specific survey to understand and measure food security. It's called the USDA Household Food Security Survey Module. This survey has been translated into a number of languages. It's been tested in a variety of ways. And all of the other food security surveys that have been done with farm workers have used the same tool. It's the same tool that, the data that like Hunger Free Vermont shares, it all comes from the same tool. It's a 16-question, really rapid survey. You don't necessarily need to be trained in research methods to administer it. It's a quick and dirty kind of thing. And so when I set out to measure food security or to understand it, I figured I should probably use the same tool. But as I'll talk about, as soon as I started using it, I realized just how badly fit it's not a great fit for families who often reside on both sides of the border. But I did interview 100 individuals. I oversampled women because women tend to have a really important role in bringing food into their household. And what I found is that surprisingly, despite some rural sort of isolation and despite, not a lot of access to transportation and really high number of hours worked per week, is that only about 18% of the households that I surveyed were classified as food insecure. This is much lower than we see in those other surveys. And so when I thought with that, and when I was looking at those numbers, I just started to realize just how poorly it reflected the additional stories that I was hearing. And after I did the survey, which is really largely based upon, do you have enough money to buy food? Invariably, after I finished the survey, most individuals will say, well, I have the money, but I can't get to the grocery store. Or I have the money, but I don't necessarily have the time to go to the grocery store. Or I have the money, but I'm fearful of speaking Spanish to my partner in public because we're concerned that someone's going to call Border Patrol on us. And so what I did is I paired these surveys with much more in-depth interviews to try to get at those additional layers of food security. And I want to talk a little bit about some of those main findings that I came out with those interviews. But before that, I think, even just plotting these results that I have a high amount of doubt about, we do see higher rates of food insecurity closer to the border. And through the interviews, people would describe very different realities of trying to access food and the difficulties that came with living in even Franklin County versus Addison County. So some of my main observations are that the causes of food insecurity, or why farm workers in the state are food insecure, are different from other communities around the country. When we look even at places like California, the Central Coast, or if we look at places like Immokalee, Florida, you tend to have greater numbers of farm workers living and working together. And so when we're talking about Vermont, which is a very rural state, maybe you have 2 to at most maybe 6 farm workers on a farm. People are really isolated. And the combination of that rural isolation with border proximity means that farm workers are often facing a number of challenges getting off the farm to get food. Um, the lack of mobility is a very real concern, and Vermont does have a really important policy that allows people who have a Vermont address to access a driver's license, the driver's permission card. But that is a state law that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't be picked up by Border Patrol. And so the lack of mobility is a very real concern. There's a lot of dependency on third parties to access food. My colleague Naomi did a study, and something like 95% of farm workers aren't doing their own grocery shopping, that they are receiving food from people who do shopping for them, or are buying food from mobile delivery programs and services that come on to the farm directly, especially those with Mexican products. And so there is this sort of separation of people from their food and the agency that goes along with, doing your own food purchasing. Since I have my daughter, my husband and I we're shopping separately most of the time, unlike we did beforehand, especially now with COVID. And what I realize is that when he goes grocery shopping, it's never exactly what I want, right? It's always something just a little bit different that I was intending. And so we can think about, if someone else is picking out your food for you, what kinds of things are you actually getting into the home if you might not have even full awareness of what's available in the grocery stores? There's also the reality, as a food anthropologist, is that I've noticed is that Vermont is not exactly a mecca of Mexican food. It's very hard to find certain ingredients. I was once on a wild goose chase with Andy Clovos, who's the director of the Vermont, or he was the former director, interim director, and now the archivist for the Vermont Folklife Center. And we were trying to make tamales for the Folklife Center's annual Dia de los Muertos event. And we went to 12 different grocery stores before we could find even a semblance of the ingredients to make tamales, which is, even in Seattle where I did graduate school, that would have taken me one store, one trip. And so while, places like City Market and even Healthy Living do have like some pretty amazing options in their bulk section, those aren't accessible to people who are living and working up in Franklin County. And so, this is an important sort of cultural factor that I find very interesting. In terms of the methods, what I have found through this project is that how we understand and measure food insecurity through that USDA model is really inappropriate for immigrant families. It's all designed around a household unit of analysis. And when I talk to farm workers, often I would get this question, well, are you talking about the household here that I live in with 3 other young men? Or are you talking about my family back in Mexico where I'm sending so much of my money to? And so even just the unit of analysis is not a great fit. And as I mentioned, it's not just about not having money. It's about all of these other elements of accessing food that farm workers often face challenges sort of securing. And I think even more sort of fundamental is that when we study food insecurity, we often look at it as a lack, as an absence of a gap, right? And these models don't allow us to understand, how are people really resilient and how are they creative and how do they get, by even with significant structural challenges. And so I'm as if not more interested in that is how do people navigate some of these structural vulnerabilities in their lives. So I want to talk just briefly before I wrap up about this project called Huertas, which is been such an important way for me to connect with the farm worker community and to talk to people and to understand, sometimes the really tremendous agricultural knowledge that farm workers bring into the state. And I'll use just a few images to highlight some of what I've learned. But I want to start out with this image. So this is from a project called El Viaje Mascaro, and you might have heard about it recently. We have a Kickstarter that's ending next week. We're pulling together all of these mini comics that we did based on interviews with farm workers into one graphic novel we're really excited about. And this is taken from one of those comics. It's called My Heart is Torn in Two, or My Heart is Divided in Two, Spanish and English version. And this tells the narrative of a woman, pseudonym Juana, kind of comparing the reasons that she was hungry or had, experiences with poverty in Mexico and the experience that she has here. And she says, well, I have to think about what I have here, because if I don't have things, now I can't just go to the store whenever. I have to cook with what I have. In Mexico, there are many stores nearby, so if we need something, we go to buy it. But here, no. Here I have to buy for 15 days worth, and if we run out of ingredients, I have to do what I can. Here we can buy the food that we want. The problem is that we cannot leave. And this gets us back to that discussion of encerrado, right? That Juana felt like her home was really the only place that she could be. And she couldn't sort of go to the store on a, even a weekly basis to get the items that she wanted. And it was such a different experience than, for example, living in Chiapas, Mexico, where she would sometimes go to the market every day. Even if she had less money there, she had a bit more freedom. And so this, I think, is an interesting sort of an important reminder that for many farm workers, food insecurity is something that they've experienced well before they moved into the United States. But what is preventing them from having food has often really shifted. So I want to share just a few images because these images I feel like tell a lot more than I ever could. And I want to share a little bit about what I've learned through gardening and through directing this project over the last 9 years since I got here. So this is Tomas, again, a pseudonym. Tomas had lived and worked in the United States for about 40 years before I met him. And he told me how prior to 9/11, he would actually go back and forth to Mexico with a lot more frequency. The US-Mexico border has become a much more risky place, not only after 9/11, but through a number of policy shifts that have funneled people into increasingly dangerous parts of the desert. Through his involvement with our program, which is, something that we connect with farm workers who are often connected with the health outreach work of Bridges to Health, and talk to people about if they have any interest in growing gardens. Well, Tomas had a lot of interest, and he also had a ton of experience. He was actually, over time, he grew 7 gardens at the farm where he lived and worked. And what I saw through working with him and interviewing him is just the amazing agricultural knowledge that he brought with him. He was a farmer who was in Vermont as a farm worker. And all of the knowledge that he has about companion planting and sort of permaculture-like techniques, which are much more rooted in indigenous techniques and knowledge, were something that he also wanted to sort of engage with as he lived and worked here. As time went by and we got to be closer friends, we had a lot of meals based on the food that he was growing. He was known to actually pack up food and mail it to his children who were living and working in Maine. For him, food was just a really important connecting point. And what we did through our project and what we do with our project is really just connect farm workers with the resources that might be hard to access, whether it's seeds or plant starts or, the knowledge that we can't grow chayote that well here. Sometimes act as a mediator between farm owners and farm workers, thinking about where the garden would best be located. And so Tomas was a really important person that showed me just the depth of agricultural knowledge that people bring with them. Lourdes, in this image, came from the same village, actually, as Tomas, and the mother of 2 children, both born in the United States. Her garden really gave her a chance to share her cultural sort of foodways with her children who were very, very far away from Mexico. She had a particular love. These individuals have all returned to Mexico. of growing chilies so that she can make chili rellenos and share them with her husband and her children. And one of the things that she told me is that she couldn't wait when she was going back to Mexico to actually start a small kind of diversified garden like the one that she grew here. And so a number of farmers, farm workers, were farmers back home, or they came from farming families. Sometimes they were corn farmers. A number of individuals from Chiapas also grow coffee. There's a couple of cacao farmers that I've met. And what we can see is that that knowledge is something that gives people a lot of meaning and a lot of identity. And gardening in the United States or gardening in Vermont is a way of extending that identity and extending those connections. That child became this child over a few years. And one of the things that I learned from Lourdes' story is just the reality that a mixed status family faces. That she often would talk about how her daughter, who was born in the U.S., had greater ability to travel off the farm and engage in sort of social life off the farm than she did. And I think that that is something that it's really important to think about, is that for families, the differential access to citizenship means that there are certain lines that are drawn within the family about leaving the farm or about experiencing Vermont in a number of ways. I've learned a lot again about sort of agricultural techniques. In this image, Elena is showing how she ties cauliflower leaves up to protect it from the sun. A tool and a technique that she brought with her from the state of Chiapas and from engaging in agriculture with her family. And so it's important that a number of farm workers are coming from farming backgrounds, but that's not the entirety of their experience. Or sometimes their grandparents were farmers or their parents were farmers, but they themselves weren't. For Elena, she did grow up in an agricultural area. And for the work that she did with Huertas and this garden that she tended at a few different places actually was where she could actually engage in practices that she had been taught as a child. She also told me about, as a child, hunting squirrels and how that was another way that they accessed food that she wasn't necessarily doing in Vermont, but was an important practice. These gardens become the site of a lot more than just growing food. Again, I think food is sometimes the byproduct of some of these gardens. They're often used as that rare space where people feel safe and feel at home in a state that sometimes is not always very welcoming. And these gardens become the sites of birthday parties, of sort of experiential learning for children. And I think any of you who are gardeners, I am a wannabe gardener. I do have a garden, but it never looks that great. Is that we know that our gardens give us so much more than the food, right? That it's a place of beauty, it's a place of leisure, it's a place of connection, and I've definitely seen that through this project as well. But not all people are farmers coming in. And Juana in this image is showing my research assistant the flowers that she grew, and there are a few tomatillos on the side. And for her, she actually had never grown, a garden before living in Vermont. It was something that she's like, well, I could plant some flowers and that will make, my home more beautiful. And actually, a lot of medicinal plants are also of high interest for farm workers in this program. And what was really interesting to me is that when we look at farm workers' lives, a lot of times they're lives of mobility and moving between farms. And this image was at the first of 3 homes where she built and maintained a garden. It was such an important part of her life that she went through the process of rebuilding that space in each of the places where she lived. This is the second gardening space, starts to have a little bit more food than flowers. And part of that was that she realized that if she was going to access fresh produce, it was going to be a lot easier for her, especially in these summer months, if that produce was close to her. She could make a decision that day that she wanted to cook something, and she didn't have to wait, often a 15-day period before she got more fresh food. So the other thing that's been happening, and I just want to leave us with this, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but part of the book also talks about the really important farm worker organizing that's been happening in the state. Chapter 5 talks about the history of migrant justice and the work that that organization has done in getting more visibility to farm workers and about and with and from farm workers. And we have just now passed the 3-year mark where the Milk with Dignity agreement has been in effect with Ben and Jerry's. Current campaign of migrant justice is with Hannaford, hopefully expanding this program to that grocery chain. So I think I also just wanted to end on this because when we think about the number of challenges or the number of obstacles that do stand in front of farm workers in accessing basic rights and basic needs, we also have examples of just tremendous food justice organizing and sort of transformational work that's happening in our food system. Full disclosure, I am on the board of Migrant Justice. I'm not speaking on behalf of this organization, but through my research and through trying to understand the importance of that campaign, those different campaigns, I feel like it's a really important lesson for us to also know is that Vermont is also the space of just really innovative and necessary food justice organizing. So I want to end there. I think we have some time for questions. I'm going to stop my screen share.
Teresa, you mentioned that the justice organizing that's happening in Vermont is sort of unique. And can you talk a little bit more about what makes it so different?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really important question. So I think one of the things that's unique about it is that, obviously we've had decades of farm worker organizing, and the United Farm Workers and the work that they often were doing in, grape production and union certification around, especially wine products and grape products in the 60s and 70s. There's a long history of farm worker organizing. And I think that that's really important history and present, right? The United Farm Workers is still a present day organization and has, experimented with things like domestic fair trade and a number of other kinds of programs. So the Milk with Dignity model and the work that Migrant Justice is doing with the Milk with Dignity program takes a different approach, which is rooted in something called worker-driven social responsibility. It is the same approach that the Coalition of Immokalee Workers did with the Fair Food Program, which is that campaign of asking corporate buyers to pay 1 more penny per pound of tomatoes and using that money to improve living and working conditions for people in tomato fields, mostly in Florida. And so the difference is, I think, between programs like the Fair Food Program and Milk with Dignity, is that the standards for the program or what makes a just workplace are defined by workers themselves, right? They are grounded in priorities. This was the result of a number of organizing years, to determine what does a just workplace look like. And the Milk with Dignity agreement and the standards were set by farm workers themselves versus set by more of a corporate social responsibility model. And so the Milk with Dignity agreement is the first time that the fair food model was extended outside of seasonal agriculture. Looks very different. Pricing structures are very different for fluid milk versus tomatoes, very different economy and climate and power dynamics and histories, right? Immokalee is a place that we often saw tremendous exploitation of African Americans, in growing, and that exploitation has shifted often to immigrant workers. So that's what makes it unique. I think that there are similar kinds of, even like I talk about this in chapter 5. The use of the term like si se puede, which originated in the United Farm Worker movement. Is still sort of carried through some of this more recent organizing. But I think the uniqueness is that the idea of what what makes just work is coming from those that are most likely to experience the benefits of that organizing. And rather than pressure on the consumer, in terms of individual consumer to do something different, the pressure is being placed upon those that are at the top of the food chain, right? Those really powerful industries that are making purchasing agreements and deciding where to put millions, if not billions of dollars. And so the pressure, ultimately with the last campaign went to Unilever versus the individuals, who might boycott Ben and Jerry's, for example, which is a very different tactic than we saw with the great boycotts in the UFW. Yeah. So there's a question from Richard. What percentage of Vermont dairy workers are here with family? How do undocumented workers go back and forth at the southern border? And so percentage-wise, I would say it's hard to get to a percentage, but of the roughly 1,200 workers, probably about 100 are women. And a number of those women, if not most, majority are here with families. And there are, a number of families with kids, US born kids that are attending public school, but it's not a huge number. I don't really feel comfortable giving a percentage, but I can say that it's not the majority by any means. It's a pretty small number. In terms of going back and forth at the southern border, this is the experience that we see, wherever we're looking at crossing, right? That it is often a process of hiring a coyote to get across. Part of my research, I did talk to some people about that process, or often it was voluntarily shared with me. But it is that same process that we hear about, in other kinds of crossing. People typically don't go back and forth that much, though, especially since 9/11 and the intensification and militarization of the US-Mexico border. People don't travel back and forth as much as they used to. And Tomas, for example, hadn't traveled home in something like 11 years when we talked. It has gotten much more dangerous to cross in the United States. It has gotten much more expensive. And I think there's also the reality that, as our economy, especially since the 2008 crash, has been weakened, the economic motivations are different than they were prior to 2008. So yeah, the back and forth is not very frequent. Honestly, of all of the individuals that I've interviewed, I have only known maybe one family that has gone back and then come back to Vermont. So it's not a very common experience. So food banks as a source of foods. Yeah, that's been a question that I've had some good conversations with, and there might be some emerging work happening with the food bank and some of the work that they're doing. So one of the things that I do explore are the different ways that people access food. Of the people that I talked to in that 100 surveys, I also did a short demographic survey that asked age, gender, first language spoken, things like that. And I think it was something like, 7 or 8 had access to food bank. It's not very common. Part of it is that food banks are built around typically a model of going to a place and getting that food. I had a great conversation with the director of the Vermont Food Bank, and he was like, how could we better serve this community? And I'm like, well, the best way is to go from farm to farm with the food. And that is an incredibly expensive and, in many ways, inefficient way of delivering food. So food banks are a source, but not a major source. Women who are pregnant are often accessing WIC. But one of the things that has changed in the time that I've been doing my research is that WIC used to be delivered to clients directly to their doorsteps, and they have transitioned entirely to an EBT system that requires you to use your card at a store. And so that has cut out a number of women who might have benefited from that program. Although at the time that I did my research, I also interviewed a number of service providers for farm worker families. They were often still doing some of that delivery. So the percentage of the workers who are helped or supported by the farmers to arrive, or are they owned to get up to here, Vermont? That wasn't the topic of my research. I think if I had 7 more years and another book to write, I definitely would have done a lot more research on the interrelationships between farm owners and farm workers. But there's a really great book that I'll recommend called Milking in the Shadows. And it's by Julie Keller. It's about Wisconsin farms. And she did research in Mexico and Wisconsin with farm owners and farm workers. And one of her main findings is that a great percentage of farm workers are directly supported by farm owners to get here, to get up to Wisconsin. And so I don't know how much that translates into the into Vermont, into the farms that we have here. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's similar patterns in some ways. Andrea's question. Hi, Andrea. Question is, have I documented any improvements in access to food for farm workers since the pandemic, given all the big food distribution events, or do the same barriers make those opportunities unavailable to farm workers? Yeah, I haven't done research post-COVID. The process of publication, I thought I had collected all of my data basically in October of 2016. And then we had our last election. And so I realized, okay, there's much more of a story I need to tell. And so I ended up doing some follow-up interviews just after the election and about people's experiences and understandings of the election and what that might mean for them. But I haven't collected more data since the pandemic started. My understanding is that in a lot of ways, the pandemic has not fundamentally altered farm workers' everyday experiences, because they were already experiences where they were, at their homes and at their workplaces and not going into public. And I don't know if people are accessing those big food distribution events, but I think that would be a really interesting thing to know. I do know that, what we initially saw, especially looking at health access and some of the concerns, is that in many ways, the isolation that farm workers often experience sort of buffered them from the contagion of COVID. But that, we haven't seen large outbreaks within the dairy worker population like we have seen in the H-2A program, visa recipients. So yeah, the next question, Migrant Justice did a wonderful report on the Milk Continuity program, and it is available on their website. Yeah, I think that report is really, if you're interested in this, even just the technicalities and logistics of how a program like that would unfold, definitely encourage you to look at it. It's a free download. It's available on their website, and I really encourage any of you who are interested in it to take a look at it. It does a nice job capturing the different ways that this program has changed some of the conditions on farms, whether it's health and safety training or ways of improving communication between employers and their employees. It's a really, really good program. So Vermont has passed some laws benefiting immigrant labor. Is there currently proposed legislation that we could be lobbying in favor for? So one of the most recent things that has happened is the relief bill, this kind of a form of a relief bill where farm workers are able to get a similar sort of COVID relief that many of us received. And so that was, as Andrea might also agree, that was a really hard fought battle that is now happening. So that's kind of done for now. I think one of the other forms of legislation, and this is happening often at a county or a city level, are the fair and impartial policing policies. And so depending on where you live, I know that right now the Upper Valley is very deeply involved in some of this. There are fair and impartial policing policies at various levels of acceptance or modification. And so anytime, you hear that fair and impartial policing policy, it's often oriented towards, preventing bias policing from happening, to anyone, but that has particular benefits for people of color. And so that is an important set of legislations that are happening in different ways in different places across the state. I'm a couple of things, that I'm working through right now. Next projects are working on a small collaborative project with the Open Door Clinic and a medical anthropologist at Middlebury, looking at oral health for farm workers, very new area of research for me. And then my next big project is most likely going to be looking at labor in the hemp industry, and using Vermont as one place to understand that, but also looking at places like Kentucky and Colorado and Oregon once we're traveling out of state a little bit more. So that's where it's all headed.
Teresa, this is Andrea. I'm sorry, my camera's not working tonight.
Oh, that's okay.
I just wanted to also mention, for people who didn't hear about it, Migrant Justice won a really unprecedented judgment in the courts to hopefully end the ICE going after particularly migrant justice activists, but farm workers in general. There was a celebration of that just last week. But the other thing I was going to say is that if people are looking for ways to help, Migrant Justice can use the help. The Open Door Clinic in Addison County, which serves a lot of farm workers, can definitely need the help. If you live in an area where there are farm workers, where there are farms, reach out and try to get to know folks and make yourself known as a trusted person who they could turn to for help, or could, be in touch with, that sort of thing, because that's one of the best ways to end the isolation, is to just enable farm workers to know that there are people in the communities that they live in who care about them, would like to, help if they can. It's sometimes difficult to know what's the best thing to do, but making yourself available as a trusted person is a good way to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for sharing that.